Curse of Strahd, Part 5, Chapter 5, The Town of Vallaki. Now, note I'm skipping over Castle Ravenloft, which is Chapter 4 of Curse of Strahd. Castle Ravenloft will likely be the finale of your Curse of Strahd campaign. It's kind of odd that it's set as Chapter 4. It likely is a place player characters will go lately. Of course, your player characters can choose which direction they want to go throughout the campaign. And if they want to go to Castle Ravenloft early, they can. It's more likely after they pick up the quest in Barovia Village to escort Arena Kolyana all the way, west, away from Strahd's view, that they'll reach Vallaki Village and then continue on to Kresk and possibly to the abbey that overhangs the town of Kresk. Now, this is the town of Vallaki itself. It's kind of oddly shaped. Note it has three different gates. These gates are unlocked but closed during the day. I should say it has much more than three gates, five gates, I believe. And there may be a hole in the gate right here. Who knows? That might be some fog. They're closed but unlocked during the day, but definitely locked at night. They are guarded by a couple of guards each night. Simple human guards for the most part with spheres. There's also a Vistani camp on the edge of town here. The Vistani are not friendly with the villagers of Vallaki. There are also some dusk elves that live here as well. They are a remnant of a people that once lived in larger numbers within Barovia. They're only male dusk elves, and there's no children either, as Strahd killed all the women or female dusk elves 400 years ago. In addition to the Vistani, at least, the people of Vallaki, much like Barovia Village, most of which don't have souls. And many of these buildings, about 25% of them in town, are completely empty. Or maybe they're not empty, they just have swarms of rats living in them. As a DM, you could have, say, instead of rats, some were rats living in them as well. Or perhaps throw an interesting creature in, like, say, the Haint from the Radiant Citadel campaign, which is a newer monster. There's also a creature that's made of a bundle of hands that's undead and breaks apart into crawling claws that also came from the Radiant Citadel campaign, which is a creature that would fit in nicely and just to be found in a random house somewhere in Barovia. There was also a few side adventures you could squeeze in. There was one low level adventure. It's like a house adventure that Van Richten, Rudolph Van Richten is found connected to, that is sort of a ghost house that is reprint. It was printed after Curse of Strahd came out, but it would fit somewhere nicely in town as well. If you want to run that adventure, it's like a little side adventure that would fit well enough in this city or town, or maybe in Barovia Village. Now you'll note, other than the houses that are scattered around, there are specific locations. This is the DM's map. The player's map doesn't have the locations noted, but I will go through each location. I won't go into detail about them. I'll just kind of talk about them briefly and why they're important. Essentially, this is the main town the player characters will get to and likely come back to over and over again. It does sit nearly right in the middle of the map of Barovia, so the player characters will likely use this as a home base, and it is the largest, most inhabited town the player characters will also come to as well. Although there aren't that many resources here. There is a church, an inn and tavern, a few shops, maybe some traders. They could, of course, trade with the Vistani if they want to, or just random people. And again, most of the people in here in this town do not have souls, much like Barovia Village. These people will not talk to the player characters more than saying a few words. They're like NPCs in a video game who don't have anything they could possibly say. They're just kind of creepy people who go throughout their normal day doing the things that they're pre programmed to do as soulless individuals. Now, as you go into this segment of the campaign, you get the initial approach to the village, which is essentially a description. as the player characters are likely coming here from the southeast. You get information on the town gates and the guards. You get the random table of what might be in the individual houses. Note that most of the houses that are or occupied have innocent Valakian townsfolk in those houses, most of which without souls, and the rest have Valakian cultists who are basically devil worshippers or people that worship Strahd. Some of them are not just cultists, they may be cult fanatics. If you have player characters coming back into town later in the 2024 version of 5e, there are some higher level, much more dangerous cultists you could bring in, like a death cultist, which would be much more of a higher level threat for more powerful player characters. You'll also note there's a lot of lore on what's happening in Vallaki itself. There are essentially a ton of side quests here or connections that will lead the player characters to different areas within Barovia in general. Plus, there are some very specific locations in town the player characters can explore, such as the Burgomaster's Lair. There's a church. There's another manor in town connected to a family that more or less is a group of servants of Strahd, and a few other locations. Now, the player characters don't have to do every one of these little rumors. They're not even connected at like a rumor table, but they would be quite useful for the player characters to pick up on, like just as a rumor, such as the purple flashes of light seen emanating from the attic of the burgomaster's mansion might be a random rumor they hear about, or any of them really. The DM can use these rumors throughout the campaign. You don't have to use them all. You don't even have to have the player characters explore every location. My group did not explore everything. They got maybe 80% of these leads and explored a lot of it, but didn't quite get every single thing. Now, the overall town is broken down by number. They don't have to be run in any particular order. In fact, let the player characters reach locations logically by, say, wandering through town and just coming across, say, the different locations as they come across them, like, coming across the sort of town square, and then eventually they'll come across the inn and tavern. But eventually they'll come onto the western side and they'll reach N1, St. Andrew's Church, which is one of the more friendly locations in all of Barovia. There is a priest here who's more or less on their side, Father Lucian Petrovich, who has a connection to the Washer House location in town. His sister is, I believe, no, not the Washer House, the Burgomaster's Manor. The Burgomaster's wife is actually his sister, remember correctly. During the night, there are some frightened Wallachian adults that are at the church, and as well as children praying for their lives, and he is more or less preaching to them to keep them alive and away from the darkness that is, well, all over their land. There's also some interesting threads here connected to this guy right here, this young man, Milo Voyage, who is involved in a scheme with I think he's the toy maker in town. Oh no, he's not the toy maker. He's the coffin maker in town. There's lots of scheming going on in Vallaki, and again, these are little subplots tied to other things. The player characters could follow these little strings and find out where they lead to. This quest has to do with the bones of Saint Andrew, which are basically saint bones that are protecting the church, and without them, the church is vulnerable to attack. Now, this is also connected to a later segment or event that takes place. It's called St. Andrew's Feast. If the player characters, after they arrive, don't find the bones within 3 days, all of a sudden, vampire spawn from the coffin maker's shop show up one of these nights and attack the people in the church and slaughter them in a horrific manner. So there is kind of a ticking clock in some cases. The player characters may not know this, but they should realize that if they take on a quest like this, or if they hear these rumors and they don't act on them, there should be repercussions. D&D is a game of consequences, much to many players' chagrin. And this is an example of those consequences. If they don't do this quest and, say, we'll do this later, well, later might come and they will never come, or the slaughter will happen and it will be absolutely ferocious, or however you want to describe it. Now, That is one location the player characters might come to, especially if they have a priest in their party. Who, in my group's case, they had a priest of Lathander who became friends with Father Lucian, who is a priest of the Morning Lord. But they might come and go. They might do these quests, or they might just move on. The second location is the Blue Water Inn. This is extremely likely that the player characters will come here. It's an inn and tavern. It is more or less run secretly by a were-raven family. And these were-ravens are more or less on the player character's side, although they won't know it. They won't like the player characters at first, but the players might be able to gain their trust. They're the Martikov family. They're connected to the were-ravens at the Wizard of Wines, and one of the problems they're having is they don't have much wine left to continue running their operation because there's been a delay in the shipment of wine. This is a lead in, more or less, to the Wizard of Wine's storyline when the player characters get here, and it's extremely likely the player characters will arrive at this inn on their way here after their first day of travel. They will probably get an in room, and they'll probably have to keep Irina here, or at least pay for an in room for her, or if they want the next morning, continue on down the road to Kresk with her, which is probably the better idea. Now, they could keep her here if they want, and maybe pay some guards to guard her door, although that won't do much good. But she's safer here at the inn in Vallaki than, say, anywhere in Barovia, of course. Now, but there could be other events that take place. Say, if Strahd learns that Irina is at the inn and not further away, if they leave her here. Now, the Keepers of the Feather are the actual family, the Were-Ravens. Again, they might end up befriending the player characters, and they will keep an eye on the player characters. They're also giving the player characters the quest to go to the Wizard of Wines and see what the delay is. They could probably pay the player characters as well, as they do have some coinage and all that. There are a couple of wolf hunters in town. These two guys are kind of grim fellows that basically go out into the wilderness and hunt animals, namely wolves, as there's a lot of angry, hungry wolves in the area. They kill the wolves for their pelts, which could be made into clothing, and also take the meat. And, well, wolf steak is a common thing you might be able to eat here at a cheap meal at the Blue Water Inn because of these two guys and everything. Now, you get their stats, some information on them, and more or less they're just some random guys in the tavern who might be, useful. Player characters could even hire them as lackeys to help them out. Who knows? They act as scouts in whatever edition of 5th edition you're using. You also get the Washer brothers. These are Nikolai and Carl Washer. They're connected to the Washer House. It's a noble family in town that basically are servants of Strahd. They're basically serving their mother, Fiona Washer, who is the real servant of Strahd and involved in a cult. You get Ructavio, who's the only main guest staying in a room here when the player characters arrive. And again, he's actually Rudolph van Richten, who is a notable character in the Ravenloft history. He is a vampire and undead hunter, and he is definitely on their side, although they won't know who he is at first. He's disguised as a half elf from a distant land who tells stories about distant lands but doesn't really sing or anything. He has a wagon as well with a saber-toothed tiger in it, in which wears armor because it's got barding, that's kept in the stockyards. He had a monkey at one point that has been given to the toy maker because he couldn't keep it at the inn. And he's been here basically a month gathering information both on the Keepers of the Feathers and trying to figure out who each of them is, but also learning more information about Strahd and his forces. And he's very likely to help the player characters, whether or not he's the person who is their ally according to the cards, the Taruka deck, or not. He is under a disguise, using a hat of disguise, also wearing a ring of mind shielding, so you can't read his mind easily. Player characters won't know that, of course, but he might eventually reveal who he is, or at least reveal that he's a helpful individual throughout the campaign when he realizes the player characters are here to help, assuming they are here to help and they're not just here doing whatever they want. Ignore iTunes trying to, load things onto my page here, by the way. There are other locations here, just again, the kitchen stable, things like that. I won't go into details about them. These aren't locations meant to be as part of a dungeon crawl, but the player characters could explore the place. Who knows? They could be thieves. There is some treasure stored here, of course, if that's the kind of player characters you have. This could be items, for example, there could be items that the player characters could be paid with here. Octavio even has a journal that is kept here. There's some neat items that the some of the were ravens have. This is the actual were raven family as well. I would suggest using this photo if you could, and just it's a great image. Whenever you have really good pieces of art like this, go ahead and show it to the player characters at some point, and they get a feel for the actual people, image wise, and all that run the place. Eventually, though, the player characters are going to leave this place. They could go to some of these other locations. It might not be right away, but one of those likely locations is the burgomaster's mansion. And the burgomaster in this particular town, Baron Vargas Valovich, is just ruthless and grim. He prides himself on his good breeding and leadership skills, but he is a dark individual like many of the people in town. He's married to a woman who's the Baroness, who is the sister of the priest in town, although the player characters won't know that. He has a deformed henchman named Isaac, who has an oversized hand and magical abilities to create fire. His son is, well, attempting to use magic, powerful magic, incorrectly to escape Barovia, and this guy's protected by these two mastiffs who are around him at all times. Now, dealing with the Baron is not a high level threat. Likely the player characters will deal with him kind of early on or somewhere around level 3 or 4, and he shouldn't be that much of a challenge. He will obviously seem evil because he more or less is evil, and he's a scheming baron who's up to his own business, basically. His son, the baronet Victor Valakovich, is essentially acts as a mage. He's probably like a hedge wizard who has trained himself to be a mage to be able to cast powerful spells. He doesn't necessarily have to have the base stats of a mage, for example, these stats or anything like that, or these spells. The DM could switch his spells out. He's basically trying to cast a teleportation circle or create one to escape Barovia, and he's failing miserably and has gotten people killed as a result. Now, as you go further into his house, you get just different rooms that are interesting. There's different bits of little treasure here and there, and the exact details don't matter with this review, but they would matter as you're playing the actual adventure. Just little connections to different things. There's a little doll collection here, which is connected to Blinsky, the toy maker. The different bedrooms, libraries, different items the player characters can find, and information as they search the house, plus some kind of twisted, dark things connected to the, summoning and all that, connected to the lesser storylines and leads within the town of Vallaki in general. And again, the player characters might even find some of the treasures here in this house, if that's what the cards say they're going to find. They might even hear the rumor about Victor's workroom and the strange light in the attic and try to investigate. Eventually, though, they'll finish up that quest and they might check out Washer House. And again, the woman who runs this house, Fiona Washer, is a longtime follower of Strahd, and she runs a cult that are literally worshiping Strahd in the basement. She has an imp and a bunch of skeletons and cultists down there, and her house is a different type of manor than you'll note than the the manor house for the burgomaster. I can show you the difference here, and you'll see that it's just designed a little bit differently, and which is a nice little touch for this campaign. There are several different little manors, including a ruined manor west of town. That's another chapter. They're just different, so unique in that way. Now, she more or less acts as a priest with different spells than most priests in the book. She's got an imp, as I noted, and she is pure evil and is just a diehard Strahd follower, more or less. Part of her cult is in the basement. They're doing all kinds of evil things. There's some skeletons, which aren't particularly threatening to most groups. And again, there's some cultists down there that are definitely not friendly. As I go through here, you'll kind of see them eventually. They're kind of in here somewhere, but nonetheless, they are quite dangerous for a low level group. But they're not a real super high level threat. They're just another little side quest that the player characters could get involved in. Here they are. There's the cult fanatics and all that. Just followers of her who in turn follow Strahd, essentially. Now there is the stockyards. The main notable thing here is that's where Octavio's carnival wagon is stored. Again, he's really Rudolph van Richten and all that, and he's got a armored saber-toothed tiger who essentially Barding that is kept here, who he keeps fed. Here's his wagon. He might be found later in the campaign when the player characters eventually go to Van Richten's tower. In fact, this wagon might actually be there, or it might not, depending on the events of the adventure. There may be another storyline later in the campaign as well. One of those events that I noted earlier that could take place due to this wagon. In fact, if I can find it here, I think it's called Lady Washer's Wish. Actually, I should say that Lady Washer's Wrist has to do with the Lady Washer, specifically the player characters being invited to a dinner party with her. But there is a possibility that this wagon and Van Richten's events here get tied in later as a little event in town. I won't go too much into it here, though. Now, there is an important location, is also the coffin maker's shop. As you could wonder, what could be in a bunch of coffins? And the answer is, of course, vampires, or vampire spawn in this case, who are servants of Strahd, powerful servants of Strahd. Now, the man who's running the shop is Heinrich van der Voort, and he is, a servant of Strahd, more or less, who is evil and fallen to darkness. He is not a very good carpenter, but he's making coffins for sure. This is a very small location. One of these locations in this house is basically the exit point to a teleport area. It's right here, actually, from Castle Ravenloft. If the player characters fall into a trap there, they get teleported and they end up right here. And then many of these coffins, I should say, are filled with vampire spawns. Now, there is an event I noted earlier. If the player characters don't kill these vampire spawn within 3 days after arriving in town and maybe going to the church, then these vampire spawn will basically get up and that night, the third night, go and slaughter all the people in the church and it'll be a bloodbath. If the player characters kill the vampire spawn before then, that event doesn't take place because they stopped it. But it is a rather dangerous location. Player characters should probably be level 4, maybe 5 at the time they do this location, and it's very likely they will, as it is incredibly dangerous. Although all the vampire spawn will begin in their coffins and they'll begin prone, you could do something as a DM where they have readied actions as soon as they start hearing anyone coming around or going around the coffin room that they basically throw the lids off and as a reaction stand up from prone and then the battle starts, for example. Now, player characters will also maybe check out Blinsky's toys. Again, this is a minor location. Blinsky and Polo, who is essentially a monkey that belonged to Van Richten, is kind of a reasonably friendly individual who makes creepy toys. And he's kind of just tied in with some of the other minor storylines, including a little side quest in Barovia Village involving a missing daughter. There's a little doll that you find there, and it leads to him. But more or less, you have all his creepy little toys here, such as a ventriloquist dummy that looks like Strahd. There's a toy gallows with a hangman. There's nesting dolls where every time you open up the nesting dolls, they get older and older until the last one is a mummified corpse. All of them are very creepy, but they're amusing in that way. And there are just more tie-ins. Like one of the dolls that's not for sale looks just like Irina Kolyana, and essentially this guy has to make these dolls on the order of Isaac Stronzi, who is that deformed servant of the burgomaster for his own means. He also is seeking a sort of the ultimate toy that was built by a toy maker, a sort of master toy maker, which essentially it's like a clockwork man who he believes is lost in Castle Ravenloft. Again, it ties into Castle Ravenloft in an interesting way without being too ridiculous. It's just like a little side quest connected to the castle itself. Now, you also have the town square as you go to the end of the chapter here, or near it at least. And essentially, this is a description of when the player characters come into town. I would definitely recommend describing this, referencing the Wolf's Head Jamboree, which is coming up, and just information on it. There again, this will lead to questions about the prior festival and others before that and what's going to happen. This event will not happen for, I believe, 7 days, give or take, but which is likely the amount of time the player characters will be in Barovia. This, unless they just spend a whole bunch of days doing downtime or something in town, this event will happen later in the campaign eventually, but it gives you another event that happens or will happen down the line. Now, there are some other little bits of information here. The DM could also put a little signboard in with possible leads, like maybe some of the rumors. Well, earlier in the chapter might be actually found here. There could be a bounty notice. There's also some gallows, and there's some commoners here that are women and children and men that have little fake donkey heads on them made of plaster and that are meant to be ridiculed and mocked. The player characters, wild guess, are going to release these people, most likely because they will think that this is evil and a really messed up thing to do to random townsfolk, which will, if they do that, basically aggravate the burgomaster, who will then go after them for doing that. It's likely to happen, though. Now, lastly, for this chapter, you get the Vistani camp, which is also where many of the Dusk Elves reside. They're not friendly with the townsfolk, and they're not allowed in the town because they are not trusted. They are strangers in this land, and they are connected with Strahd. Well, Van Richten believes they are servants of Strahd, or suspects it, and he's correct. These particular Vistani are. That doesn't mean all Vistani are, by the way. Just these particular Vistani. The Dusk Elves aren't necessarily allies of Strahd. They are kind of tragic figures that really aren't detailed that well here. They're kind of mentioned, and they have a couple of members, like this guy Casimir uh, Kov, I believe is his name is. He's more like a spellcasting elf that the player characters might encounter. There's a pair of brothers here, Luvash and Aragol, who are more or less the main servants of Strahd, mostly Aragol, who the player characters might have encountered before when the adventure began, the campaign began, as he's likely an individual who might have given the player characters a letter inviting them into Barovia if the DM chose to use that approach. He will likely show up later if he doesn't get killed here at the camp at some point. But the Vistani, like many of the people in town, have a little side quest. A well, Luvash's 7-year-old daughter, Arabelle, recently disappeared from the camp. I believe she's somewhere near the lake north of the area and it disappeared a day ago, and they don't know what happened to her, and they would like her found. For some reason, they're not able to really do it themselves, or they have been looking, but they just haven't been successful. If the player characters want to get on the good side of the Vistani, then they perhaps could help find this missing child as an act of righteousness and good. There are a bunch of hovels at the base of the hill, on the top of the hills where the Vistani tent is. These are essentially where some of the Dusk Elves live. Again, all the Dusk Elves are male. All the women were women of this land. The Dusk Elves were killed by Strahd 400 years ago, one of which haunts Castle Ravenloft to this day. There could be other Dusk Elves in other lands, though, that are just not commonly found here. And this particular Dusk Elf is connected to the storyline of his sister basically being dead as a ghost in Castle Ravenloft. He also has some spells, and he has a ring of warmth and a few other objects. Player characters might even be able to barter with him, things like that. The Vistani might be useful when it comes to gaining information that is harder to find for a price, but also they might be traders who have access to goods that come from outside Barovia that they might be able to trade with the player characters, although probably for a higher price than what the book price would be, essentially. Now, as you go into the end of this particular chapter, you do get the details of these different wagons and the families that might live there, the gambling wagon, the sleeping Vistani in one wagon, all that kind of stuff. And then you get the details of the special events that will likely happen in town. And again, these are just the next festival that's going to happen, or there's I mentioned it earlier. Tiger is another event involving the Washer sons. Essentially, they let the tiger out, and then it just kind of attacks them. I believe it's not an evil tiger, but it might seem that way. It's an armored tiger. It's wearing barding, like half plate barding. There's also Lady Washer's Wish. I mentioned it earlier. Essentially, she just invites them to a dinner party to get them on her side, mostly because she wants to act against the Burgomaster. It's possible she even wants to be the Burgomaster, but he's not dedicated completely to Strahd, although he is evil. So she really wants the player characters to work for her with this little event that could happen, a day or two after they arrive and all that. And again, I mentioned St. Andrew's Feast, which could be a slaughter at the temple of the Church of Lathander, which could take place. More or less, this whole chapter is a lot of locations and some potential events, but there's a lot to the town of Vallaki, much like the town of Barovia that the player characters could do. Doesn't have to happen in any particular order. That's kind of why it works so well, and it is what it is. But overall, the town of Vallaki chapter is another 5 out of 5. It's really well thought out. It's a lot of side quests that aren't super important that they all have to be done, but it gives a lot of options and adds a lot of flavor to the campaign in general. The town itself is very interesting, and it will take the player characters a lot of little side. It's a little bit of extra time to explore everything, and there's little for example, one of the manor adventures in this adventure would be a 4-hour adventure to itself just to explore. These are not these are more like optional little mini adventures. They don't have to happen like, say, Castle Ravenloft, or the player characters don't have to go to the Wizard of Wines, but they likely will. These locations are almost optional, but they're great additions to the overall campaign. So overall, 5 out of 5. I highly recommend. Obviously, the player characters explore as much as they can here, and the DM use as much as you can for this segment of the campaign. Now, guys, if you like my reviews, you want to see more of them, please continue watching my reviews. Like and subscribe. Check out the Patreon if you can. The links are in the description. And stay tuned for more content.